Hello class, today we're going to learn about food webs and the basic roles each organism or thing have by using pictures and graphs, and basically I have one right behind me. Before I show you the graph, I just want to tell y'all about how food webs basically display relationships of certain type of communities, and no matter where you are in the world, hot or cold, there's always going to be some sort of food feeding relationship that organisms or things have in these type of communities. And there's always going to be something being hunted or hunting something. So behind me, we're going to be using this food web, and it's basically like a basic um, food web displaying the types of organisms in the Great Plains area. Can anyone tell me where the Great Plains area starts or begins or ends, basically? Yes. Oh, good try, but no. So the Great Plains area starts in Montana, and it comes all the way down to Texas, and it basically just stretches throughout that whole like place. And for starters, can y'all tell me what this is? Yes, it's the sun. Easy, right? So this everything starts with the sun in these types of food webs because the sun gives energy to the producers. And can anyone tell me the process that the sun giving energy to the producers is called? Like, what does that turn into? So, not exactly. The process in which the sun is relevant to the plants is photosynthesis, which isn't a term that you need to know right now, but it's basically the process in which producers make their own food out of sunlight, and it's just basically that the sunlight gives energy to the plants, whichever it is, and it just produces their food, and it makes because it's made out of chemicals, but they need some sort of way of powering up. And then right after the producers comes a primary consumer, and primary consumers usually just eat the producers. It doesn't have to be corn necessarily, but it can it always has to eat the producer because the primary consumer is most of the time is going to be a vegetarian, meaning that they're not going to eat meat, just things like plants, and that's their way of surviving. Just class, for example, can someone tell me primary consumer? Yes, go ahead. Yeah, a rabbit. Yeah, like a rabbit is always gonna eat some like sort of plant because they can't eat meat, and that's another example um, of what a primary consumer can be. Also, a primary consumer doesn't necessarily have to be small. Like for example, right here I use the grasshopper. They don't necessarily have to be small, but for this example I use that. So moving on, after a primary consumer comes a secondary consumer, and a secondary consumer usually eats the primary consumer. And for this example, I used a turkey because turkeys usually eat grasshoppers, and be- grasshoppers usually can't fight off the turkey, and so that's like their next step. And again, can someone name a secondary consumer for me? Go ahead. Oof. Yeah, a plant isn't going to be a secondary consumer. Usually, a secondary consumer can be both vegetarian or a carnivore or even omnivore, which is, again, not a term you need to know yet. But, yeah, a secondary consumer always eats the primary consumer. After a secondary consumer comes a tertiary consumer. And for my example, I used a snake because a snake can eat a turkey, mostly because of their venom. They present themselves as a threat to the turkey, and honestly, if we wanted to, class, we could switch these two positions over because they both present a threat and can eat each other necessarily. All right, kids, I wasn't going to talk about this other group, but since we are talking about food webs, I thought it would be necessary to talk about it. So each of these groups can basically, except the sun, can basically die, and basically they just don't go away. That doesn't happen in the world. So basically, there's a group called decomposers, and they are usually compromised of bacteria or sort of organisms that can eat up the dead remains of each of these consumers and producers, and ultimately they just become nutrients that go back to the producers, and that's another way that producers essentially grow, and it all turns into a big old loop. All right, class, now it's your turn to choose and basically tell me your thoughts or your examples of a producer. Yes, correct. All right, what about this primary consumer? Oh, of course, of course. And what can eat this secondary consumer? Okay, okay. The tertiary consumer? All right. And if all of these die, what do they become? Or what takes over them and decomposes them? Yes, that's right, decomposers. An easy one right there for y'all. Thank you, class. And y'all have a great rest of your day. All right. So I think all of this can help English language learners by using pictures that they can easily just use from background knowledge, and they can basically just show the teacher or the classmates organisms or plants that they think belong in the food web. I think it makes science easier for them, and I think that if they're struggling with using the right English word, they could just go to the visual cues that we have up here in this type of diagram. Thank you.